Have you ever wondered why we keep searching? Why, in the quiet moments, in between the noise of everyday life, there's this lingering feeling that something is missing? It's strange, isn't it? We chase after success, relationships, pleasures, and moments of escape. And yet, no matter how many things we grasp, there's always that unspoken question, is this it? This unshakable thirst, this restlessness inside us, it's older than civilization itself. It was there in the hearts of wandering sages sitting beneath ancient trees, in hermits retreating into silent caves, and in kings who abandoned their thrones in search of something the world could never offer. This isn't just a modern crisis, it's a timeless human condition. We are by nature seekers. Some seek wealth, some seek love, some chase fame, power, or meaning. But behind every quest lies a deeper, unspoken hunger, the longing for freedom from suffering. Not just freedom from physical pain, but from the invisible, gnawing weight that drags at the heart. Buddha called it dukkha, the unsatisfactory, impermanent, and fragile nature of existence. And whether we name it or not, we feel it. In heartbreak, in fear, in the way joy slips through our fingers like grains of sand. And so, across thousands of years and countless lifetimes, humanity has pursued one singular treasure: enlightenment. But what is enlightenment? Is it a blinding flash of insight, a mystical state beyond comprehension, a final escape from the endless wheel of life and death? Or is it something far simpler and infinitely closer than we've been led to believe? The great sages of old spoke of enlightenment as not something one can truly grasp with the mind, nor define with words. It's not a concept, it's not a theory, it's not a place we travel to. It is, in essence, waking up. Not waking up from sleep, but from the deep, persistent illusion we call reality. We've been taught to believe that the world is solid, permanent, and controllable. That happiness lies somewhere outside of us, waiting to be found. That we are isolated selves moving through an objective universe. But what if none of that is truly real? What if it's a dream we've collectively agreed to dream? This was the discovery of the Buddha over 2,500 years ago. After years of self-denial, intense meditation, and searching in all the wrong places, he sat beneath a bodhi tree and made a simple yet world-shattering realization: everything is impermanent. Nothing possesses an independent self. All attachments bring suffering, and within every being lies an unchanging, deathless awareness, our true nature. And yet, even though this truth is so near, it remains hidden, buried beneath layers of habit, distraction, and craving. We don't notice it because we're too busy chasing pleasure, chasing security, chasing identity. We believe enlightenment is some distant peak, reserved for monks, saints, or yogis who renounce the world. But the ancient masters insist it's here, it's now, and it's available to anyone willing to look. The question that remains, the one that mystics and philosophers have debated for centuries, is whether we can realize this truth without practice. Can a person, living in the thick of ordinary life, wake up spontaneously? Or must we train, discipline, and purify the mind to peel back the veil? Some traditions say that enlightenment is your birthright, already present, waiting to be uncovered. Others warn that without diligent practice, one remains trapped in illusion, no matter how close the truth may be. And so, the debate lives on. Is enlightenment a matter of grace or effort? Is it sudden, like lightning, or gradual, like dawn? Is it possible for an ordinary person, burdened with responsibilities and flaws, to touch this timeless freedom? The path ahead isn't about adopting dogmas or blind faith. It's about inquiry, about examining the very nature of our experience, about daring to question what we've always assumed to be true. Because until we see for ourselves, beyond philosophy, beyond belief, we remain restless travelers, chasing shadows in a world of impermanence. And yet, perhaps it's in this very longing that the first light of enlightenment stirs. Perhaps the question itself, why do we seek, is already a doorway. For if there's a hunger, there must be food. If there's a thirst, there If you've ever tried to describe a dream after waking up, you'll know how slippery words can be. No matter how vivid it felt in those twilight moments, as soon as you try to explain it, it dissolves. What was clear suddenly turns vague. What was alive now sounds flat. And so it is with enlightenment. Every mystic, sage, and awakened being who has ever attempted to speak of it has run into the same wall. Words are tools of the mind, and the mind can only grasp what it already knows. But enlightenment isn't an idea. It isn't a belief. It's an experience that exists beyond thought, beyond the boundaries of language, beyond everything we've ever named. You can point to the moon with your finger, but the finger isn't the moon. And most of us, distracted by the pointing, forget to look up. Throughout history, different traditions have tried to name this experience. Some call it nirvana. Some call it moksha. Some say it's God realization, union with the absolute, or awakening to the nature of reality. But at their heart, these are just labels of fragile attempts to capture something infinite. The Buddha himself was cautious about this. He often refused to answer metaphysical questions. When asked whether the universe was eternal or finite, whether the soul existed after death, or what lay beyond enlightenment, he remained silent. Why? Not because he didn't know, but because any answer would trap the seeker in concepts. And concepts, however noble, can become prisons. Instead, he offered a path, a way to see directly, not through blind faith, not through inherited beliefs, but through first-hand experience. The Zen tradition illustrates this beautifully. A famous Zen master once said, "A finger points at the moon, the fool looks at the finger." Enlightenment, then, is seeing the moon, not hearing about it, not believing in it, not memorizing poems written by those who saw it, but seeing it for yourself. It's a shift so profound, so intimate that the old self, the one made up of fears, hopes, labels, and stories, can no longer survive. It's like waking up from a lifetime of dreaming and realizing, with a mixture of shock and joy, that you were never who you thought you were. But here's the catch. The mind loves certainty. It wants definitions. It demands form. And yet, the moment you try to wrap enlightenment in a definition, it slips away. Because what you're looking for isn't a thing. It isn't an object out there to be obtained. It's the formless awareness within which all things appear and disappear. It's the silent witness behind every thought, every emotion, every experience. And the irony is, it's always been here. It's not something new you gain. It's what remains when everything false falls away. Like clouds clearing to reveal a sky that was never broken. But if it's so close, why don't we see it? Because we mistake the noise for the signal. We get entangled in our thoughts, our identities, our endless preferences and aversions. We chase pleasure, avoid pain, and spend our lives running from one moment to the next, never noticing the silent presence that holds it all. Imagine standing in front of a vast, still ocean at night. If you keep staring at the waves, you'll never see the reflection of the stars. Enlightenment is turning your gaze away from the waves and noticing the infinite depth beneath. And here's a truth few dare to say out loud. You don't have to become someone else to realize this. You don't have to renounce your life, shave your head, or move to a monastery in the mountains. Those are outer forms, and while they can help, they're not the essence. The essence is a simple, direct seeing, a moment of clear recognition, and for some it happens suddenly, like lightning splitting the sky. For others, it's gradual, a slow dissolving of illusions, one layer at a time. But for everyone, it requires one thing, a willingness to question everything you've ever assumed about yourself and the world. Because the truth isn't hidden by distance, it's hidden by attachment, to ideas, to stories, to the illusion of control. And so when people ask, what is enlightenment? The honest answer is, you'll know it when you see it. And when you do, words will no longer matter. It's like trying to describe what it feels like to fall in love to someone who never has. You can use poetry, music, metaphors, but until they taste it for themselves, if the truth is already here, if enlightenment is not something to be gained, but something to be uncovered, Then why do we practice at all? Why sit in stillness? Why follow precepts? Why endure discipline and devotion? Wouldn't it be easier to simply realize it right here, right now? It's a question that has haunted seekers for centuries. But to understand the role of practice, we must first understand the nature of the mind. Picture a crystal-clear mirror. By its nature, it reflects everything perfectly. The sun, the moon, a passing bird, your own face. But over time, dust gathers on its surface. Not because the mirror itself has changed, but because it lives in a world of wind and motion. And so it is with the mind. At its essence, it too is pure, vast, and luminous. But layer upon layer of habit, craving, fear, and identity settle upon it like fine dust. Not overnight, but grain by grain, breath by breath, thought by thought. And here lies the quiet tragedy of human existence. We forget that we are the mirror, and instead we mistake ourselves for the dust. Practice, then, isn't about becoming something new. It's about remembering, about gently, patiently, persistently clearing away the dust until the natural clarity of the mind shines through once more. Not by force, not by denial, but through awareness. When the Buddha taught meditation, he wasn't offering an escape. He was offering a way to see clearly, to watch how thoughts arise and pass, to notice how clinging creates suffering, and to realize that what we cling to isn't who we are. It's like standing in a room filled with smoke. You could pretend it isn't there. You could try to hold your breath. But eventually, the only way to see clearly is to open the windows. Practice is the act of opening those windows. It's sitting in silence not to stop the mind, but to notice it. To witness the constant stream of stories, anxieties, and daydreams without getting pulled under. And in doing so, something remarkable happens. The mind begins to settle. Like muddy water left undisturbed, clarity returns. But make no mistake, this isn't always easy. The dust has been gathering for years, lifetimes perhaps. Some of it clings tightly. Old wounds, deep-seated fears, patterns we inherited without question. And so the path of practice demands courage, not the kind that charges into battle, but the quieter, steadier kind. The courage to sit with discomfort, to face the parts of ourselves we'd rather avoid, to meet our own shadow with open eyes. In Zen, there's a saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The point is clear. Practice isn't a means to an end. It's the way we live in harmony with our own nature, not to gain enlightenment, but to let it reveal itself in the ordinariness of each moment. A single breath, a quiet cup of tea, the touch of morning sunlight on your face. These are the places where the sacred hides in plain sight, and practice is how we learn to see. There's a beautiful story of a monk who approached his master, frustrated. "I've meditated for years," he said, "and still my mind is restless." The master smiled and handed him a broom. "Then sweep," he said, "and let each stroke of the broom sweep your mind as well." The lesson was simple. Every act can be practice if done with presence, and every moment is an opportunity to clear away a little more dust. But here's the subtlety. Practice isn't about perfection, it's about sincerity. Some days the mind is calm, some days it's a storm. What matters is that you keep showing up, keep sweeping, keep sitting, keep breathing. Because each moment of genuine awareness leaves a trace. And over time, those traces carve a path not to somewhere else, but back to the still, open awareness you've always been. It's not about earning worthiness. You were never unworthy to begin with. It's about removing what covers what was never broken. And this is why traditions across the world, from Buddhist monasteries to quiet forest retreats, speak of practice as a kind of cleansing. Not to make you into something else, but to reveal what you've always been. Like polishing a lamp whose flame never went out, but whose glass had grown dim. And as the dust clears, something extraordinary happens. The suffering that once felt so personal begins to loosen its grip. The patterns of craving and aversion grow softer, and glimpses of quiet joy, unprovoked, unconditioned, begin to arise. Not because you've acquired something new, but because you've stopped carrying what was never yours. And this is the quiet power of practice. It turns the ordinary into the sacred, the breath into a miracle, and life itself into a field of awakening. But of course, not everyone agrees, for there are those who claim that practice is unnecessary. That realization can strike in an instant with no effort, no discipline, no method at all. And so, for those seekers, another debate begins. One that has echoed for centuries in temples, forests, and Some say it takes a lifetime of practice. Others whisper it can strike like lightning, unbidden, unexpected. But a deeper question lies beneath them both. What if what we're seeking has been here all along? What if the mirror we've been trying so hard to polish was never tarnished? What if it's not about finding something new, but remembering what we forgot? This is the heart of one of the oldest, most profound debates in Buddhist philosophy, the question of Buddha nature. The ancient masters called it Tathagatagarbha, meaning the womb of the Buddha, the inherent potential for awakening within all beings. Not a gift to be earned, not a blessing reserved for saints and sages, but a truth already present in every heart, hidden beneath layers of dust and delusion. The Mahayana Sutras speak of it in tender, poetic ways, like a priceless jewel buried beneath a poor man's hut, or a seed lying dormant in the frozen ground, waiting for the warmth of spring to bloom. According to this view, enlightenment isn't something you gain. It's what you are, right now, this very breath, this fleeting moment of awareness. But here's where the debate stirs the waters. If our nature is already enlightened, why do so few realize it? If the treasure lies buried in our own backyard, why do we wander so far, searching in temples and texts, gurus and retreats? Some schools insist it's because of ignorance, a fundamental misunderstanding of who and what we are, like a man in a dream who forgets he's dreaming. The moment he wakes, the illusion dissolves. Others argue that while Buddha nature exists in all, it's obscured by countless lifetimes of karmic habit. And though the jewel shines within, it takes effort, practice, to clear away the mud. A famous Zen parable tells of a man running through a dark forest, chased by tigers. In his terror, he leaps off a cliff, grabbing a vine. Below, a pit of snakes. Above, the tigers wait. Clinging to the vine, he notices a single drop of honey on a nearby leaf. And in that moment, tasting the honey, he is free. The parable reminds us, even in suffering, even while dangling between fear and death, there's a sweetness to this life when seen clearly. Is that sweetness the taste of Buddha nature? Or is it merely a fleeting pleasure, masking the deeper truth? That's the question teachers have wrestled with for centuries. In one corner, you have the sudden realization schools. Masters like Huineng, the sixth patriarch of Zen, who taught that enlightenment can dawn in an instant, not through gradual practice, but by directly seeing into one's true nature. In the Platform Sutra, Huineng declared, "There is originally no tree of enlightenment, nor a stand of a mirror bright. Since everything is empty from the beginning, where can dust a light?" To him, all distinctions between delusion and awakening are illusions. The very act of seeking enlightenment creates separation. But in the other corner are those who caution against mistaking intellectual understanding for genuine awakening. They warn that claiming, "I am already enlightened," without dissolving the self-centered habits of mind is like mistaking a reflection of the moon for the moon itself. In the Tibetan tradition, the image is of a clear sky. The mind's true nature is vast, open, ungraspable. Thoughts and emotions are like passing clouds. They might obscure the sky, but the sky is never harmed. Yet the recognition of this sky-like awareness is not something one can be told or think their way into. It must be directly seen. And here's where the debate sharpens to a fine point. If Buddha nature is within, how do we realize it? Is it by ceasing all effort and simply resting in what is? Or is it through years of discipline, of peeling away the veils one by one? Perhaps the answer is not one or the other. Perhaps it's both. A Zen saying puts it like this: "You cannot polish a tile into a mirror." And yet through polishing, the illusion of separation may fall away. Maybe it's not that practice creates enlightenment, but that sincere, wholehearted practice reveals what was always there. Like a traveler walking in circles through a foggy valley, only to discover he's been standing on sacred ground the whole time. This understanding shifts everything. It means that every moment, no matter how mundane, how messy, how full of craving or sorrow, carries within it the seed of awakening. The angry shout, the lonely evening, the aching heart, each one a thread in the tapestry of our unfolding. We no longer need to wait for the perfect conditions, or the ideal teacher, or a quiet mind, because the door has always been open. The very act of noticing, this breath, this thought, this ache in your chest, is itself a kind of awakening. The old masters knew this, which is why, in some traditions, a master might laugh out loud at a student's desperate question about how to attain enlightenment, or offer a simple word, a sudden clap, a finger pointing at the moon, not to dismiss the question, but to reveal that the one asking is already holding the answer. So where does that leave us? It leaves us right here. In this body, this breath, this ordinary, irreplaceable life. The debate about Buddha nature will likely never be settled, and perhaps that's the point. Because in chasing answers, we miss the simple, unspeakable truth, that what we seek is what we already are. And yet, even knowing this, the pull to seek, to practice, to polish remains. Why? Because while the sky is always clear, the clouds are stubborn. And so the question arises again. If enlightenment is already here, should we still practice? To find the answer, we must step beyond philosophy, beyond debates and words, and look directly into our own lives. And that's where our next step quietly waits. It begins with a question, whispered in countless hearts across centuries. How does it happen? In a flash, or over a lifetime? Some say awakening is like lightning, brilliant, sudden, and fierce, shattering the darkness in an instant. Others insist it's more like the steady rise of dawn, a soft, gradual unveiling of what's always been there. And across the dusty scrolls of Buddhist history, both stories live side by side. One of the most famous tales comes from ancient China, the story of Hui Neng, a poor, illiterate woodcutter who became one of the greatest Zen masters. He wasn't trained in monasteries. He didn't recite sutras. And yet, upon hearing a single verse from the Diamond Sutra, something inside him split wide open. In that instant, without a teacher's guidance, without formal practice, he awakened. The verse was simple. Abide nowhere and awaken the mind. In a flash, Hui Neng saw the futility of clinging to thoughts, to things, to even the idea of self. And with that, the veil lifted. His story became a beacon for those who believed in sudden enlightenment, a realization not earned by effort, but sparked by a single, perfect moment. But for every Hui Neng, there is a Milerpa. Born in Tibet, Milerpa was a man burdened by terrible karma. He committed grave crimes in his youth, driven by anger and revenge. When remorse finally crushed his heart, he sought a master and vowed to redeem himself. And yet his teacher Marpa did not hand him wisdom easily. He sent Milerpa to build a stone tower in the mountains. When it was finished, Marpa ordered him to tear it down, then to build another, and another. Years passed, his body broke, his spirit shattered. And yet through the agony, through labor and heartbreak, a clarity began to form. The work wasn't punishment, it was purification. Slowly, the thick walls of ego, fear, and regret began to crumble. And when the day finally came, and Marpa granted him the teachings, Milerpa's heart was ready. His enlightenment did not arrive in a single moment, but through years of struggle and surrender. His story became a hymn for the path of gradual enlightenment, where realization blooms like a lotus petal by petal, lifetime after lifetime. Two masters, two paths, one truth. And in between these legends, countless others walked their own ways. Some found awakening in meditation halls, others while watching the moon's reflection ripple in a puddle, some during the birth of a child, others in the stillness after loss. There's the story of the Zen monk Gyude, who would simply raise a finger whenever asked about enlightenment. One day, a young boy imitated him. In response, Gyude cut off the boy's finger. As the boy fled in pain, Gyude called out his name. When the boy turned, Gyude raised his fingerless hand. In that instant, the boy attained enlightenment. Shocking, brutal, yet in the context of Zen's fierce compassion, it was a way of shattering the student's attachment to form, even to the finger that pointed to truth. It reminds us that enlightenment refuses to be bound by methods. It can wear any face. In modern times, stories continue. A woman lost in grief suddenly feels herself dissolve while sitting by a hospital bed. A man stuck in traffic experiences a moment where the self falls away, and everything, the cars, the sky, the frustration, becomes one seamless, boundless presence. No chanting, no monastery, just life itself, raw and unfiltered. And yet for many, practice remains the ground, the anchor. Even masters of sudden enlightenment often emphasize practice after awakening. Why? Because realization may come in a moment, but embodying it takes a lifetime. Like a musician who hears a perfect melody in a dream, but must train for years to express it. Or a poet who glimpses infinity in a heartbeat, but spends decades finding the words. The Zen saying goes, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The path continues because the mind is endlessly creative in building new illusions. Even the insight of no self can become a new ego. Which brings us to an essential truth. Whether it comes in a flash or over lifetimes, enlightenment is not an endpoint. It's a beginning of seeing things as they truly are, a beginning of shedding what is false, a beginning of living from a place beyond fear, beyond craving, beyond the desperate need to grasp. And in this, the old masters offer a quiet reassurance. It doesn't matter how long it takes. It doesn't matter whether you're struck by lightning or walk 1,000 miles. The only thing that matters is walking. One breath, one step, one honest moment of seeing. Because in truth, the stories of sudden and gradual enlightenment are not two paths. They are one, and every being, whether they know it or not, is already on it. Some sprint, some crawl, some stop to marvel at a flower, but all are moving toward the same home. And what is that home? They say the ancient world moved slower. Days stretched like silk across the horizon. Monks sat beneath Bodhi trees, listening to the hush of wind through leaves. The clatter of kingdoms, the weight of empires, barely touched those silent mountains. And now here we are, in a world lit by neon, ruled by algorithms. 1,000 notifications clawing for our attention. Emails, deadlines, the endless scroll of other people's lives. And yet, the question remains, is enlightenment still possible? Or has it become some antique ideal, a relic of a quieter age like papyrus scrolls and temple bells? For those on the path today, it feels harder. The mind constantly pulled by screens, noise, and worry. Even the idea of sitting still for 10 minutes feels rebellious, maybe impossible. But perhaps this age isn't a barrier. Maybe it's the perfect training ground. In ancient times, distractions came in the form of droughts and invading armies. Now they arrive as pings in your pocket, different forms, same challenge. The Buddha himself warned of the monkey mind, restless, grasping, leaping from thought to thought. And if anything, our monkeys have grown wilder. But here's the secret. Every generation thinks its distractions are the worst. And yet, in every era, a few brave hearts turn inward and find the same vast silence. Modern masters have begun to emerge. People who live in cities, hold jobs, raise children, and yet they touch something ancient and endless. They remind us that enlightenment doesn't require a monastery. It doesn't demand robes or rituals. It asks only for presence. It might arrive in the most unexpected places. In a crowded subway car when you realize you are not your irritation. At a funeral when grief strips you bare and you glimpse the tender, unbreakable thread of life itself. Or in a sleepless night, staring at a cracked ceiling, when the last illusion of control finally crumbles, and what remains is something wordless, luminous, and vast. Modern teachers offer new language for old truths. They speak of flow states, being in the now, radical acceptance. Psychology brushes against Dharma. Neuroscience maps the pathways monks once traced through pure awareness. And yet the essence has not changed. It is not about escaping life. It is about seeing life as it is. The messy, the beautiful, the painful, the astonishing. To witness it without clutching. To feel joy without fear of its ending. To meet sorrow without drowning in it. There's a famous Zen saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." But in the modern version, before enlightenment, check emails, wash dishes, pay bills. After enlightenment, check emails, wash dishes, pay bills. The world outside may not change. The endless demands, the impermanence of all things, they remain. What changes is the one who moves through them. A shift from resistance to acceptance, from craving to contentment, from self-absorption to boundless compassion. And perhaps this age, frantic, fractured, fast, is uniquely suited to test this. When there is nowhere to run, no forest to escape to, no ancient temple on the hill, one must make a monastery of the heart. To find the stillness not in absence of noise, but in the middle of it. Enlightenment today may not look like a monk in saffron robes. It might look like a mother cradling a crying child with infinite patience. A nurse holding a stranger's hand in a hospital corridor. A barista smiling at a homeless man no one else sees. Small acts, tiny awakenings. Moments when the self falls away and what's left is pure, direct, wordless being. And though few may reach the heights of the old masters, perhaps that was never the point. The goal was not perfection. It was presence. Not to transcend the world, but to meet it fully. Not to become a saint, but to become real. And if you're wondering whether that's still possible, if in this digital storm, a human heart can still awaken, know this: it already is. Right now, somewhere, someone is letting go of a grudge. Someone is noticing their breath for the first time in years. Someone is choosing kindness over cruelty, patience over fury, silence over endless noise. Enlightenment didn't leave us. We left it. And it waits patiently in every overlooked corner of ordinary life. So perhaps it's not a question of whether it's still possible, but whether we're ready to notice it. And in the final chapter, we'll arrive at the heart of this mystery. Not what enlightenment is, not whether it can happen quickly or slowly, not whether it belongs to monks or mothers, but the single, silent truth that's been calling you all along. And that's where we'll go next. And so we arrive at the place every seeker eventually reaches, not at the end of the road, but at the realization there was never a road at all. Enlightenment was never a destination. Not a prize, not a title, not a glowing aura reserved for mystics in distant mountains. It was and is the simple clarity of this moment exactly as it is. But here's the paradox. If it's already here, why practice at all? Why sit in silence? Why study teachings, trace sutras, or watch these humble videos searching for ancient wisdom in a modern tongue? Because while the truth never leaves us, we leave it. The world with all its glitter and ache seduces us away. We forget. We fall asleep in waking life. We build stories about who we are and what we need. We chase and flee, grasp and resist, and practice. Practice is how we remember. It's not a punishment, not a duty. It's an act of profound love, a daily coming home to what has always been waiting for you. Each breath a chance, each moment a doorway, each act of kindness a tiny awakening. And no, you won't always get it right. Some days the mind will roar like a storm. Some days you'll forget every beautiful thing you ever heard. Some days you'll drown in doubt, anger, restlessness. And those are the most important days to practice. Not to achieve perfection, but to meet yourself with compassion. Not to escape suffering, but to turn toward it, to see it clearly, to touch it gently and say, even this belongs. Every step on this endless journey matters. not because it takes you somewhere new, but because it strips away what isn't you. Like a sculptor chiseling away stone to reveal the shape that was always inside. And so, dear traveler, if there's one thing to carry with you from this journey, let it be this. Do not seek enlightenment as a treasure to claim. Seek it as the honest, tender way you meet each moment. Let your practice be how you remember your own vastness. Let your kindness be how you dissolve the illusion of separateness. Let your stillness be how you hear the silent truth singing through all things. Because in the end, there is no ending. Just this breath, this heartbeat, this fleeting sacred instant, and one day, perhaps in a quiet morning or a crowded street, or a dream you barely recall, you will realize you were never lost. You were home all along. Pause, and if this journey spoke to something deep inside you, if it stirred a memory, a hunger, a calm you'd long forgotten, then I invite you to walk a little further with us. Subscribe to this channel for more timeless teachings woven for this modern world. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, your doubts, your moments of quiet clarity. Your story might be the light someone else is waiting for. And remember, the path isn't ahead.